Today we're going to talk about virtual and remote work in this new age that we've now come into. I think that we can all agree that probably working arrangements are going to be a little bit different coming out of this COVID crisis. And so it's good for people to understand what that employment engagement could look like. So today we are talking to Vanessa Radich. Vanessa and I have known each other for 9 years, we were just discussing. And Vanessa has had huge depth of experience growing technology teams for the likes of Vend, Timely, and Fuel 50. A lot of the growth of those teams and ultimately the management of those teams in her role as a people and culture manager have been of virtual and remote workers, particularly with Timely, a fully remote organization. So what I thought we would do today is we would pick her brain about the employment life cycle of a virtual and remote worker, beginning with the initial engagement and assessment and induction of those people. So Vanessa, thank you very much for coming along today and talking to us.
Thanks, Jules.
No worries. So let's talk about the initial engagement of virtual and remote workers, beginning with the kind of the attraction and initial engagement that they have. How do you go about doing that?
So I think for probably the best experience I can draw on here is my experience with Timely. So as you've mentioned, Timely are a fully remote organization. They're about 80 to 90 people split all across the world. And, you know, being a remote first organization, when we were talking about attraction, it was a lot of attraction through our networks. So they were in a unique position at that time where they were a remote first organization and everybody else was still in office. And so that was their unique selling point. And we had a lot of people who were interested in joining the business because it offered them that flexibility working from home that they didn't have with their current role, which meant that we got a lot of interest in applications through our network, and that can be really great. Having a lot of interest in your network, but that also has some pitfalls as well.
Sure. Were there different channels that you used to attract remote and virtual workers as opposed to your typical on-site workers?
It was much the same. So it was again heaps through our network, and like a lot of tech businesses, we didn't rely heavily on Seek, but when we needed to push something out to a wider group of people, we would use LinkedIn for that.
Sure. And as far as you brought these people in, you've caught them into your net of recruitment, and then so what then happens? How do you go about assessing someone remotely? Because people rely on face-to-face interviews, gut feel, etc. And as we all know, as we've all experienced from the VCs that have been going on and in this current time. And the recruitment and assessment that's going on right now, it just feels different, right? So what are the kind of the techniques that you use for assessing those people?
I think with assessing, I mean, you're probably going to hear me say this a lot, to be honest, but with assessing people remotely, you can't rely on that gut feel as strongly as you would with an in-person interview. In person, it's so much easier to build rapport, make somebody feel comfortable, get them to open up quicker. Over a video conference, that's a lot harder. Some people really struggle being themselves over a video call. It can feel awkward, and so you may not be getting that person to put their best foot forward. So you do have to be a lot more structured. I think we all know that, or we've all been into a lot of interviews where you kind of look over the CV 10 minutes before and then go in. It's very off the cuff. And with a remote interviewer or something over a VC, you have to be a lot more structured with your conversation and want to dig out, certain parts of that person's experience. And that goes right the way back to when you're scoping your role and when you're setting up, or you're kind of thinking through what you need for the role when you're writing that job description. It's at that moment that you really need to step out exactly what the interview process looks like and what's going to be achieved at each stage, because off the cuff and unplanned and reactive just doesn't fly in a remote setup.
Sure. How do you respond to that? Because to be able to to be able to validate without gut feel, I imagine there's a bunch of different things you use. Like, do you tend to use more psychometric, more kind of data-driven techniques? Do you extend your process out?
I think it's definitely about extending the process out. For me personally, more than relying on something like a psychometric. So how can you take the time with whatever stage of the process you're at to help that person who's on the other end of the call feel comfortable, just like you would use some of those techniques if you were in person. And gut feel is one thing, but even I think in person conversations, gut feel is not reliable. Interviewing is an art, it's not a science. It is ultimately a flawed process, I think. So in any, in person and remotely. So how can you give yourself and the candidate enough time to fully assess each other? And I think the only way that you do that in any process, be it remote or virtual, but particularly remote, is by actually spending some real quality time together, so that the barriers get lowered. You can really see who that person is. They can really see who you are. And by being really planned, so that you know exactly what you're assessing at each different stage of the interview process.
Sure.
But to be honest, I'm happy to see the end of gut feel, because I think gut feel is an enemy of diversity, and so, like, sayonara, gut feel.
It's luck out there, gut feel.
Yeah.
And I think that given that there's a whole bunch of really interesting and effective assessment tools out there, I'd suggest that that the way to respond to the elimination of their gut feel would be to look at rigorous, defendable technical testing, for instance, to look at some easy to understand or benchmarked kind of personality profiling, to ensure that the person who is going to be managing this person gets to spend a couple of sessions with them, and you're looking at someone else to validate that whole kind of cultural fit, a checklist of things that they need. Is that kind of in line with what you'd expect from those virtual and remote assessments?
I think I would just take a really close look at what is working at the moment. So maybe you do maybe you have an interview where you talk about values, and you talk about values alignment. Instead of, I guess I'm personally not a huge fan of psychometrics. So instead what I would do is I would craft an interview around, okay, these are the values that we have in this organization, and this is how in interview we talk about those values, and we assess whether somebody is on the same page as us in terms of what they value in their professional life. You probably have a technical test that you run in an in-person interview, so it's just actually about spending some time to go, okay, how can we run this virtually? Maybe it's sharing a screen, doing some peer programming, whatever it is that works for you in person. It just takes a little bit of brain power to go, okay, cool, how can we make that how can we make that remote? But because it is not rocket science, it's just a little bit of like careful planning and thought that goes into it. And yeah, I'm really about that. As I've just said, I'm really about that values alignment versus that kind of the culture fit. I think that's a loaded term these days, and we've got to be looking at what people are adding to our culture versus how are they fitting in to what we already have, particularly with these remote organizations where a lot of the hiring has been done through people's networks. That's kind of the downside of hiring through your network, is you ultimately build up a lot of diversity debt that you then need to repay. And so trying to reframe the conversation around values alignment, I think, does a better job at bringing people in that are truly values aligned versus on a surface seem to be a cultural fit.